right, how do we perform a segue without directly making a button? How do we do it in the code? I'm going to add a new view controller. I'm just going to drag and drop that guy in here. I'm going to add a button, and what we did in the past was we used a button. We right-clicked and dragged over to the second segue, or to the second view controller, and we did one of these options. We'll just do show for now. So we have that show option right here, that segue. When we tap it, it goes to this one. So the problem, or what's been posited, is how do we do this without having that button here, without having a direct thing? Like, how do we do this through the code? For example, let's do something like this. Let's create a text field, and we're going to have a text field here. We're going to add a button here, and we're going to say that button is submit or something like that, and this will be where they'll type in a name. And let's say if they type in the word red, then we're going to perform a segue to a view controller that has a red background. So let's add a view controller. We'll toss it down here, and I'll just select it, go to my attribute editor, I'll select my view, and change the background to this kind of magenta pinky thing. All right, so we have this view controller just kind of floating over here, and we have this view controller floating over here. Before, we were right-click and drag the button to the next view controller. Instead, I'm just going to select the view controller itself, which we could select the scene up here or this little icon right here. Actually, the one that says view controller, which will change based on its title. And I'm just going to right-click and drag that over. So just to do that again, I'm grabbing this little button right here, or I can grab it in the outliner view over here. And that's what I'm going to right click and drag, and that just creates a new segue. And that segue is going to be a show segue. But there's no way to activate this right now. And you can see the segue lives right here. And it's popping this guy to this guy, and it's not going to do anything. So we need to give this what's called an identifier. So we can select it, and this is how we're going to identify it in code. And we're going to give that segue an identifier. It's found in the attributes inspector. It's this top one called identifier. I'm going to call it red segue, and I'll hit return. Okay, and let's make another view controller really quick, and we'll toss that down here, and we'll say if they type in the word blue, it'll go to this one, which will have the background being blue. Again, I'm just really kind of picking random colors here. Same way to create a segue, we select that top view controller button, and we drag and drop it over here. We hit show, and we'll label this segue. So again, I have to select the actual segue here. I need to give it an identifier. I'll call this blue segue. Okay. So let's go ahead and open up our code now. So I'll open up a side view and click on my viewcontroller.swift file. So a couple things. We have our submit button and we have a text field. So if we're detecting the text field, like what information is being input in there, then we need that as an outlet, right? So I will just click and drag that and have that as an outlet. And we'll call this text, I'll say like my text field, something like that. And then the submit button is going to be our function or our action, right? So we're tying it to the class as an action. I'm going to call it submit button tapped, and I'll say connect. So now I have my function code right here, my text field up here. So let's write an if statement. So if my text field is equal, or let's say my text field.text, right? The text within my text field is equal to red, then perform this action. If, let's do this, we'll do else if my text field.text, which we don't really need the else, equals blue, then perform this action. Okay, so we got those two chunks here. And then last we'll do else my, if it's just something else, we'll say print error. Okay. So we have these expressions. Now what's going on up here is we did not put quotes around our stuff because we're dumb. So we'll put quotes around our strings that we're evaluating, and we're good to go. So next step, how do we say perform a segue? Okay, in the Apple documentation, there's perform segue with identifier. That's what we're going to be using. It's part of the UI view controller class, which we're part of that class already. So I need to type in perform Segway, and we'll see there's a bunch of different options. There's should perform Segway, can perform unwind, there's unwind. We're going to do perform Segway with identifier, hit return. So the identifier is asking what's the name of that Segway, and for me, and that's a string, so it's in quotes, it's going to be red Segway. Sender any is fine. Let's do another perform Segway down here. And this one will be blue Segway. Sender as any is fine. You can just click that and hit return if you want to get those little tabs to go away. So we're saying if our text field's text, what's it asking for? We can fix that with the dot self. We could also just put self in here. It doesn't really matter. We're fine as it is. So perform Segway with identifier red Segway, perform Segway with identifier blue Segway. All right, let's give it a try. Okay, so it's running. We're going to type in the word red. And hit submit. It pulled up the red Segway. Let's type in blue and hit submit. And it pulled up the blue Segway. So that is how essentially you perform segues with identifiers. It's really an easy process of creating the segue and then marking it and selecting an identifier, giving it a custom name, and then calling upon that in the code.